The Brussels Report podcast.
Welcome to the sixth episode of the Brussels Report podcast. My name is Pieter Cleppe. I'm the editor of BrusselsReport.eu. And I'm very happy today to have as my guest Fredrik Erixon, who is the director of ECIPE. ECIPE is a very influential think tank here in Brussels and in EU policy circles, dealing with international economic policy and regulation. Fredrik, the director in particular, he's also quite influential. He was selected by the Financial Times as one of the most influential voices when it comes to trade here in Brussels. So welcome, Fredrik.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks for having me, and congratulations on the launch of the podcast and Brussels Report.
Thank you. I think it's going well, and it's great to have you here, especially as a Swede, perhaps as Sweden, the one of the member states in the EU that is, let's say, still more in favor of free trade across the political spectrum, both the left and the right. So I think I don't think it's a coincidence that you are from Sweden. But of course, in every member state there are fighters for free trade that we can witness. So let's start with something that has become, unfortunately, I would say, more fashionable in Brussels. And that is EU industrial policy. So in particular, the French EU Commissioner, Thierry Breton, is pushing for this. So perhaps could you shine your light on this? I mean, what are the latest developments? Because to a degree, the EU has always been pursuing some kind as something like an industrial policy, and do you think what is being proposed is going in the right direction or in the wrong direction, or are there perhaps at least some things that are good about it?
Well, I mean, I think the first things to start with is that I think there is a case that you can make for an industrial policy, and I think there has been a case for industrial policy for quite some time, but it is what we generally would call sort of more of a general horizontal industrial policy, where you try to improve the conditions or the opportunities for companies inside Europe to grow and develop, innovate, compete, etc. And if that's the type of industrial policy that is pursued, which I think we should pursue, then you are going to focus on how can you knock down different sort of barriers that exist in the single market. You will look now, for instance, at how can we improve capital markets so that we can have a lot more of European savings going into investments in startups, entrepreneurial projects, for instance. We would look at the supply of human capital, which is becoming an extraordinary big problem for Europe, where there are huge supply restrictions or huge supply problems for especially high-skilled labor in many parts around Europe. We take a country like Germany, we sort of expecting to have a 3 million shortage of highly skilled labor in Germany in 5 years' time. Already now, there's a huge absence of computer engineers, AI engineers across Europe, which of course is putting a lot of problems for companies that want to move with technological development and compete globally. So, I mean, that is the type of industrial policy that we know from history that has worked best. You improve the general conditions in the market for growth and dynamism. The problem now is that we are looking much more towards an activist industrial policy. Sometimes it's called a picking winners type of industrial policy, where you have governments, in this case the EU Commission, plus member state governments that wants to give a particular embrace to certain type of companies, sometimes certain type of technologies. They now talk about creating ecologies in Europe for industrial growth. And they have pointed to, for instance, battery production, for hydrogen production. And the Commission, together with member states, wants to pour resources into this development. It's not exactly the case that firms themselves have been asking for all these resources, but of course they are going to take them when they're being offered by the European Commission and by member states' governments. I mean, this is the direction of industrial policy right now. It's becoming a lot more activist, and it wants to pick winners. It thinks that it can engineer a market in Europe where we're going to generate more innovation and more competitiveness by basically relying a lot more on government decisions. I think that it's totally wrong. I don't think it's going to lead to much industrial development at all.
And in that regard, the sort of the carbon tax regime, I mean, it's not entirely part of the, let's say, the industrial policy in theory, but in practice, at least that's my impression, that it serves to create European champions, so to speak, by taxing competitors from outside of the EU.
Yeah, I mean, this is a policy, of course, that is being sold on many different grounds. Mm-hmm. We're waiting now for the European Commission to come with the proposal. There has been a leaked proposal out which suggests that, in a few heavy energy intensive sectors, especially raw material sectors, that is going to be a border carbon tax that will be put on companies that are exporting from other countries that, at least in theory, doesn't pay as much in carbon emissions as you would do if you if you produce in Europe and have to buy allowances from the emission trading schemes in order to emit more carbon. I think, when you look around Europe, you're certainly going to see industries that say that this is totally necessary in order for the European industry to be competitive in the future. I have doubts about that. I have doubts partly because there are lots of studies already looking into whether the increase in carbon costs in Europe so far actually has led to reallocation of production from Europe to other parts of the world, which is the entire reason for why you want to put up a carbon border tax. And so far, these studies are not pointing to any substantial degree of trade reallocation or production reallocation at all. Mm-hmm. And when you think about it, it totally makes sense, which is that carbon emission costs are only one part of the cost, and most companies are going to deal with that in different ways. Many will deal with it by investing in new technology, new equipment that are leading to much more energy efficient production. And over time, that cost is not going to be substantial in the broader context of all the costs that a factory or a company will have when they are producing. Then you can see certainly some companies thinking that, well, if we actually introduce this carbon border tax, it means I don't need to invest as much as I would need to do without the carbon border tax. So if you are saddled with old technologies that is not very energy efficient, this carbon tax is already actually going to be a gift to you. You're going to be faced by less competition from abroad and less pressure to invest in more productive technologies.
That's interesting. And that brings us to, let's say, the overall trade debate that I also wanted to discuss with you, where we have, let's say, many aspects, but let's maybe start with Brexit and then talk about other things. So I mean, in the most ideal of ideal worlds, the EU had been listening to the years and years of British complaining and at least, gone some way in the British direction. I'm personally convinced that this would not have settled the Brexit debate in the UK, but it would have helped Cameron to at least win the referendum. But that did not happen. And then, well, we ended up what we have now, Brexit, and a deal that disrupts trade, sadly, but at least avoids the worst disruptions. So what's your idea about this? Is it still possible to let's say to save more of the EU-UK trade, or are we looking at yes, let's say more protectionism even in the future?
Well, I think it's almost certain that we're going to have more friction coming in the future in UK-EU trade relations. Mm-hmm. And I think I build that thesis sort of not so much on trade policy or trade practices or trade experience. It's much more about the fact that when you distract or when you close sort of the type of arrangements that we've had in the past 40, 50 years with the UK, that is not just going to be a one-off. It is going to set off lots of different type of dynamics and processes that is just going to be difficult to control. It's very difficult to sort of build up something new just when you have left the old. And so I would imagine that the big debates around the Northern Ireland Protocol, I mean, that's just a harbinger of what's going to come in the next couple of years. It's going to take sort of another decade or two before I think the EU and the UK will be in a position where they can start to talk a lot more constructively how they can deepen the relation for the mutual benefit of both of them. So I'm not that sort of positive or optimistic about EU-UK relations in the near-term future. I think we are in for more friction and more controversies.
Sure, and what about, of course, the big prize of Boris Johnson and the Brexiteers, the fact that you will now have what I always say, regulatory competition. The UK able to scrap GDPR, to scrap REACH at some point. Isn't that going to be ultimately a good thing for the EU, perhaps, because the Brits can sort of do better, show a different way, a bit like we've seen with the vaccines, even if that's up for debate, of course.
Well, that would be my cynical, perhaps even egoistic viewpoint. I mean, being sort of a member of the European Union myself, what I would ideally like is to have a highly competitive UK on the doorstep of Europe that provides a lot more institutional competition to the EU, that deregulates, that takes positive, constructive policy changes, that opens up for innovation, technological change, more market dynamism, because I think that in the long term is what's going to prompt the EU to go in the same direction as well. So that type of institutional competition, I think, would be great to see. Now, I don't have much hope that this is the direction that the UK will take. And I think sort of the broad direction that we see in UK politics right now, I think, is moving much more in the direction of a pretty statist form of policy with more tax and spend policy, more big government, perhaps with some odd positive changes to some types of regulations, but I wouldn't hold my breath on that. I think the UK is virtually going in the same direction that the rest of the Western world is going to, which is much more government, much more belief in government, much more belief in the idea that government actually can generate a lot more and a lot better outcomes from markets than what markets themselves can generate.
Well, I'm afraid you're right in that. Maybe one silver lining is an interesting policy change in the UK that has not received a lot of attention, but the fact that they will welcome, according to some estimates, up to 3 million people from Hong Kong, Hong Kong that is currently being crushed by the Chinese Communist Party. So I mean, perhaps in practice, these people are not going to come. These are just projections and nobody really seems to know for sure. But maybe also tying that into the EU debate, you mentioned earlier how important skilled migration is. I think personally this is very completely different from the debate about border protection and unskilled migration flows coming in. But I mean, what in practice can EU countries, EU member states and the EU policy level do to sort of attract more talent, as you mentioned earlier?
Well, I think that's a very good question, and just to reinforce that point, I mean, this is not just about problems of finding highly skilled labor right now. This problem is going to be exacerbated in the future, partly because in many populous European countries like Germany and Italy, for instance, we're going to see a nominal decline of the labor force, meaning fewer and fewer people are going to be in the labor force as the country gets older and as that balance between people in retirement and people at work is changing to the benefit of people in retirement. So this is a problem that is going to grow. And it's not that we are now confronted or offered easy solutions to it. When we've had human labor or human capital problems in the past, we've managed to deal with that, for instance, by increasing the labor participation rate for women, That was sort of a big thing from the 1970s. It's still an important thing for many European countries to do, but most countries have already increased the female labor participation rate to such a degree that you're not looking sort of at easy ways sort of increasing the labor supply in that way. Moreover, it's not that Europe is alone in confronting this development in the world. We also have a shrinking labor force in China. We have similar developments in Japan and South Korea and some other countries, leading to a lot more competition for highly skilled labor in the world. So it's not that there's going to be millions of Hong Kong or, say, India-based computer engineers that really wants to come to Europe and work. There will be some of them, but Europe will have to do a lot better in attracting them. And I think that includes lots of different things that needs to happen. It includes tax changes, that you make it far more attractive for people to come and work in Europe, not for the rest of their life, but for a short period of time in their careers. We need to be able to have workplaces that are more flexible. Depending on what countries we're talking about, it may be that they need to start to open up for other languages being used in offices. It may not be as easy for an Indian engineer or a Singaporean businessman to learn Italian in order to go and work in Italy. So there are both government policies and corporate policies that I think will be necessary to change if we want to attract highly talented people around the world to come. And you're right. I mean, this is different from asylum policies, or, we can have a discussion about what is the right way to go for European countries in terms of humanitarian refugee policies. But this is a completely different issue. This is sort of goes to the core of our future economic development, and it's not about humanitarian needs. This is about core economic strategy.
Do you think, just to continue a little bit on that, I mean, this is maybe very, let's say, optimistic, but techniques like more online work and like programs like Fiverr that allow you to hire IT engineers from all across the world, and even basically with 5G physical meetings, like replicating them in a visual way. The term escapes me at the moment. Basically technological facilitation of virtual meetings. I mean, isn't that perhaps going to be, let's say, a massive difference as compared to what we've seen in the past?
No, I think you're completely right about that. And I think
holograms. That's what I was looking for.
No, I think you're completely right, Peter, about that. My only concern in that regard is that, so if you have problems attracting labor, and if you have a sort of a short supply of labor domestically, if you combine that with a border policy, which is more defensive or even more protectionistic, well, then you're not going to be able to generate the results that you want to generate here. So the problems right now, when we are both in practice raising the barriers for skilled migrants to come to Europe, at the same time as we are trying to find ways to reduce our dependency on foreign invented technologies, or firms that are supplying us with foreign technologies, that is going to make it harder and more costlier to find alternative ways of working, which will enable that modern online digital migration that you were suggesting. So that policy, or that notion that we can utilize technology in order to address this particular problem, that also builds on the notion that Europe needs to be open. We cannot have this talk, as we constantly have in Europe right now, about cutting dependency on others, or that we have been naive, that we have allowed American platforms or tech firms to take up such a large share of the market as they have right now, etc. You cannot combine these two policies. Either you go for more openness, which allows you to substitute labor migration, or you don't. And then you're going to find it even harder to find people who can actually deliver the type of services that companies need, either by being in Europe or supplying them online from another part of the world.
Mm-hmm. Good. Maybe before we finish up the trade, two more topics quickly about trade. First of all, Mercosur. So there was a deal in principle, so to speak, or concluded by the EU between the European Union and Mercosur, which is Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay. I think those 4 countries. And as I understand, I mean, it's quite telling also that there is opposition to that deal by Ireland because they're afraid of the excellent steak imports from Latin America. But also in the Netherlands, there was some grumbling, in Austria at some point. I mean, and that's, I personally think that's quite concerning, because you have let's say the more pro-trade member states no longer standing up for trade. So what do you think about that?
No, I mean, it's an interesting case in the sense that the typical protectionist, or those countries that typically lean towards protectionism, the Mediterranean countries, they're actually very supportive of this deal, barring France.
Yes.
While it's the more sort of traditionally free trade leaning countries that are now putting up opposition to the agreement. And the opposition, it's sometimes, as you said, agriculture protectionism, like in the case of Ireland, where they're afraid that a good Argentinian steak is going to have negative consequences for Irish beef farmers to export their steaks to Europe. I think that is so. I think that is wrong, but it's wrong in 2 different ways. It's wrong because I think it should deny European consumers to actually choose for themselves whether they want to have a steak from Argentina or a steak from Ireland. But it's also wrong in the sense that the agreement itself isn't actually going to lead to a lot more import in total. So you're going to increase the quota for beef exporters from the Mercosur countries, but the total quota for all Europe's import of beef steak is not going to increase. So it's not that we're going to have a market that is sort of awash with high quality steaks from Argentina or Brazil here. Now, look, I mean, I think this issue, Mercosur and the trade deal there, it's quite indicative of where we are in European trade policy right now. I mean, I would even go as far to question that we have a trade policy.
Okay.
I mean, typically trade policy basically means that you have an idea how you're going to negotiate for better market access in foreign countries so you can increase your exports. And if you are sort of a typical trade policy negotiator, you would say, well, we pay a price for that, and that is that we need to increase the import as well, because we're not going to be able to get a deal that only leads to more exports. It's also going to lead to more imports. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think for the time being, we only negotiate with 2 countries, and that's Australia and New Zealand. We don't have any other negotiations that are going on. We don't have any proposals for new negotiations that are going on.
While Britain is trying to join, and they may actually be successful, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or whatever the new name of that big arrangement is.
That's right. CPTPP.
Yes, who can remember?
Funny acronym for it. Yeah, that's right. So Britain wants to join it, and it may be that America is going to join it in the future as well. I put forward the idea that Europe should get ahead with them and join it before them, and
Absolutely.
use it as a platform for negotiating better market access, better trade rules more generally in the Asia-Pacific area. But I don't see that going anywhere with this commission. We have a highly defensive commission that is much more concerned about increasing new regulations, to increase new barriers to trade with other countries, to sprinkle more money on domestic companies and cut them different type of favors. And I think that leads to a situation where I don't really see that we have a trade policy anymore.
Well, apart, of course, and that's maybe the last element I want to discuss with regards to trade, China. So at the end of last year, the German EU presidency rushed to conclude this investment pact with China, and opinions are divided on to what extent that actually opens up trade a lot. But still, it seemed to be a step in the right direction when you purely look at trade. On the other hand, there seem to be very weak guarantees against things like forced labor. Now, I'm not big on attaching all kinds of conditions on trade, but so like slave labor, of course, should be banned. So I mean, we've seen then the tit for tat sanctions over the Uyghurs between the EU and China, with China imposing sanctions on think tanks and on politicians. So it looks like this is frozen at the moment. So what's your opinion on this issue? What should the EU do? Should it try to unfreeze this issue or should they just play hardball with China?
Well, I mean, you're right. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon that this agreement is going to be taken out of the freezer. But I think we also need to recognize that this agreement itself was probably already dead before the sanction process started. Mm-hmm. So even if China is going to lift the sanctions on members of the European Parliament, I don't think that means that this agreement is going to be ratified by Europe. And I think this is partly because the benefits that comes from this agreement were not insubstantial, but they were not strong, and they are not distributed in a way across Europe, which means that all countries are going to benefit in one way or the other from the agreement. I mean, this is an agreement that is basically tailored to favor certain type of industries, predominantly in Germany and in France. And if that is the distribution of benefits that will come from agreement, you can rest assured that many countries will actually object, because there is a political cost by agreeing to this deal with China. And I think sort of another problem that also exists is that, I mean, I think from a member state point of view, you would sort of need a little bit more clarity about where Europe is going with China after this deal. I mean, is this the only deal that they imagine, or do they see this as the first part of a sequence of deal that is going to improve market access for trade with China? Because if this is the only deal, well, then I wouldn't be recommending governments to approve it, because there are huge problems that needs to be addressed as well. And then it's better to go back to the drawing board and continue negotiation until you get to a point where you have a pretty good deal that is not just a deal that combines some investment protection issues with some investment market access issues. You would also start to deal with other issues, including, for instance, public procurement protectionism in China. You would go into certain industries and sectors where China are particularly close to the rest of the world. So I think that's how I see it in the first place. Now, perhaps more interestingly, especially if you look at the broader debate right now, where different relations with China are going, I think Europe sort of is making, broadly speaking, the right call to avoid a lot of trade confrontation with China, to avoid sort of following in the footsteps of Trump and Joe Biden in introducing different sets of tariffs or taking other measures. China is one of those countries who are just too big to let it sort of hang there on their own and think that this is going to be beneficial for the development of the global trading regime more generally. I think it's highly necessary that we find a way where we can get China to open up its economy a lot more, but where we still, have the ambition to make sure that China is going to be part of the broad division of labor in the world economy. If we try to cut it out, I think that's going to lead to a lot more problems than finding a way to, broadly speaking, accommodating China within the system. But that of course requires that we will find a way for China to open up its market a lot more than it currently does.
Is a reform of the World Trade Organization perhaps a method to let's say reboot the Western China relationship?
Well, it could be. I mean, I wouldn't hold my breath when it comes to WTO reform. I think there are some fundamental flaws in the entire structure of the WTO that were visible a long time before the China issue became perhaps the most prominent issue in the global trade and the global economy. So yes, I mean, I'm more than happy to see countries taking initiatives to reform the WHO, but the problems there go a lot deeper. So in the first place, I think this is a lot more about finding ways for the large economies to basically come to an arrangement for how China gradually will have to open up its economy. In the first place, to avoid that, in this case, Europe and America are going to respond by introducing a lot more trade frictions or trade barriers against China, because that is what is going to happen unless China begins to open up a lot more. It may be that in the future there will be the sort of good prospects for having more of a liberal institutional based type of regime like the World Trade Organization. But the WHO was basically a construct on the basis of strong American leadership for the entire world economy and for the provision of security in the world economy. And I don't see America willing to offer that type of leadership anymore. So that's why I also think that just making technical change to the WTO without thinking about that broader geopolitical context for how we arrange power relations in the world, that's not just going to do it.
Mm-hmm. Good. Let's go back to Europe. You mentioned already that the current European Commission is let's say, quite keen on regulation and has, you could say, a more protectionist tendency, at least compared to some of its predecessors. But let's single out in particular digital regulation. The Commission is coming up with proposals for a so-called Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act. I understand that there is some opening foreseen in that, but it seems to be heavily focused on harmonization, and also it seems to be focused on imposing all kinds of duties on digital companies that in some cases may perhaps reduce free speech. It also seems to be biased against US tech, or at least that's my impression. What's your idea on this?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, we have these two different acts, the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act, but that comes together with lots of different policies that aim basically to regulate technology and what you can do with technology. We have our proposals for instance, a new regulation of AI, which is more of a principles-based regulation, thinking that AI is something that you can regulate generally, that you not just regulate the products that use AI, but you regulate the technology itself. It's basically like, regulating steam technology and thinking that's going to deliver something good for you. You have other regulations on copyrights, on disinformation, et cetera, et cetera. So look, I mean, I've never seen such an onslaught of new regulations that are being proposed as we've seen in the past 2 years from this new commission. I don't think we've ever had such a regulation-friendly and regulation-heavy commission as we have right now.
Okay, well,
the DSA is, I think about it more sort of as a control power type of regulation. It's something that we see also going on in many different member states and see it in other parts of the world, which is that when old news, information, opinion hierarchies are collapsing, incumbent powers want to find ways to get back to the old model. So these are basically regulations that they go in the direction of trying to find someone who can edit the internet and someone who can avoid that nasty opinions are going to be expressed on the internet. The Digital Markets Act is much more about Europe's way to deal with the fact that it hasn't had any platforms that have been as successful as sort of Amazon, Apple, Google, Facebook, etc. So there is a lot of sort of market envy and a lot of ambition here that you can regulate something which weren't invented by you. Now, some people in the European Commission are going to say, no, this is not about sort of regulating American tech or being anti-American, but I think it's bleeding obvious that this is what it's all about. This is not, it would never have happened if we were talking about a development where European firms would have been at the vanguard of the platform development in the world. So this is what it's all about. And when you look at the construction of, in this case, the Digital Markets Act, it's just completely bizarre. I mean, if you look at the restrictions that are going to be put on any company that they call a gatekeeper, meaning that they are big enough and have a pretty substantial market share across Europe, this is basically cutting down their ability to innovate and continue to develop their services and their markets, which I don't think is going to be good for Europe. Certainly not going to be good for the broad technological development in Europe. It's not going to be good for all these countries in Europe that have prospered substantially by importing foreign technologies, using platforms in order to make their economies a lot more productive. Now we're raising the cost for it.
In that regard, I just saw that the European Data Protection Supervisor is now proposing to ban face recognition, to have a general ban on face recognition in public spaces. I'm not sure what that will mean in practice, but I mean, I can sort of see the logic, of course. I mean, you can think of some Orwellian future, but on the other hand, I mean, to impose an outright ban seems perhaps unwise.
Yeah, I mean, this comes from the proposed AI regulation, where they sort of list different applications of AI that will be outright banned. They also list different type of things that may not be banned directly, but where there had to be sort of a pretty strict license procedure in order to get an approval that you can use this particular technology. And when you look into it, I mean, the way they specify some of these things are just bizarre. I mean, they're talking about having a license procedure for Bayesian technological decision making, which is just one of those areas where sort of, well, this is a sort of basically a mathematical formula. You have to apply it in different circumstances in order for it to be meaningful. So why do you want to have a license system for what mathematical formula that you're going to use when you compute your algorithms or when you begin to design the system that you're going to have? So, I mean, this is just sort of one example of many where we have this trend where we think governments are a lot more smart and a lot better than the market to try to figure out what would be a good development in the future, what would be a good technology to have. So again, we come back to this issue that the European Commission, like many other governments, think there is a switch that you can just turn it in one direction and then you're going to have a development that is a lot better for them. While in fact, of course, we're talking about a development that no one really knows what's going to happen. We have to discover that together. And we're going to discover that by having a lot of trial and error with new technologies that will be applied in different type of products. And then we'll see what works and what doesn't work. No one really knows this. And the worst thing you can do is to try to make the decision already that governments are better than others to figure that out.
Yeah, and it strikes me that the debate is sort of changing a bit, or at least some people are waking up, like, for example, Axel Voss, who's a German MEP from Angela Merkel's CDU. I mean, he has taken a very public position against the GDPR regulation. He calls it innovation hostile. And I remember a few years ago when GDPR was announced, it was a consensus. Oh, this is a good thing, and this is the European standard that the EU is going to impose on the world. And the EU was very proud when the CEO of Apple, Tim Cook, was praising the GDPR, probably because Apple can deal with the bureaucracy better than competitors. I think that's quite telling that at least you have some, let's say, mainstream voices starting to question the direction. Is that your impression as well, or?
Well, I mean, at least a little bit, but I think this is basically still street theater on the fringes than being sort of part of the core direction of European development. I mean, I think it's beginning to hit home to a lot of people that GDPR may not be this sort of panacea that everyone thought it would be, sort of the perfect balance between, on the one hand, protecting data privacy, and on the one hand, avoiding that we're going to crush a lot of development technologically and economically that goes on. And now sort of more people are beginning to realize that this is what is going on right now. I mean, Axel Voss was actually one of the architects of the GDPR regulation.
Oh, there you go. There you go.
And he was not just an innocent bystander. He was sort of very much cheering on the development that we had, and sort of this broad thinking that, well, now finally we're going to find a way to basically put the big American platforms on a leash, and we can do that at the same time as we improve the conditions for not just European citizens, but also for European businesses to continue with their development. And you're also right, which of course is ironic, that the big platforms, they know exactly how you take a regulation like GDPR, or for that matter, what is proposed now through the Digital Services Act, and you flip it around and you make it an entry barrier that is just going to entrench the market power they have. I mean, this is what we've seen with Apple and GDPR. They're not just been cheering it on, but they also use it as a way to increase the price that different type of app developers have to pay in order to get on the Apple platform, basically the App Store. You perhaps have followed this debate between Apple, or this conflict between Apple and Spotify, and Apple and gaming developers. I mean, if you are in my age, you will have kids who play games like Fortnite and Roblox, and they have had a pretty open and nasty conflict with Apple because Apple is charging them sort of a heavy price for them to use the App Store in order to reach customers. And this is what you can do because of regulation. Apple just changed its setting as well on the basis of privacy and GDPR. In order to avoid having other countries with pre-installed apps on their phones and iPads. So they will know how to turn this around and make it an entry barrier for others. So it is a bit strange that you have someone like Thierry Breton, the European Industry Commissioner you talked about, who's been on this campaign against American platforms, saying that they are too big to care, or that we are now, through the DSA and the DMA, are going to find ways to break up their market powers and make them a lot more responsive to consumers and market developments. In reality, you're doing the opposite. You're handing a lot more market power to these platforms through these regulations.
Interesting. Well, at least, there's Axel Voss who converted, and as they say, there's more joy in heaven for one sinner who repents.
Indeed.
And this actually all reminds me of medieval European cities, I think like Frankfurt, banning Arabic figures because they sort of preferred Roman culture over Arabic culture, and that did not turn out to be the brightest move, so was overturned. But now we have the problem that a lot of that may happen or will happen at the pan-European level. So there's no longer the option of Luxembourg or Portugal coming up with a diversion regulation, which I would say is perhaps quite dangerous. And that brings me to my last question for you. I mean, the European Union after Brexit, the British are gone with their, despite all, quite a lot of friendliness towards innovation and free trade. I mean, where are we heading with the European project? Is there cause for optimism despite the fact that the current Commission is perhaps not overly friendly to free trade and innovation?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is cause for optimism in the sense that bad policies will eventually show their ugly face, and there will be opportunities for course correction and opportunities to improve policies in the future as we go forward. So, I mean, there are never any lasting victories, nor are there ever any lasting defeats. So I think there will always be opportunities for good and sound, constructive policy reforms in the future. Now sort of the broader speaking for Europe, where it's going, and I don't think it's going anywhere. And I think that this is one of the problems, that we are stuck sort of in a mindset of status quo, where our unwillingness more broadly to have an adult conversation about what type of constitution that Europe needs, what type of division of power we should have between the central level in Europe and the national, perhaps regional levels, that just creates a lot more opportunities for what I would call sort of more of a techno-populism type of development, where there are increasing opportunities for technocrats like in Brussels to put forward their agenda, because no one is really willing to engage in a broader discussion about subsidiarity or the broader vision of labor politically, constitutionally in Europe. At the same time, Brussels are afraid of the development of new parties in Europe. They are concerned about how can you find sort of a political accord for Europe now when the old accord, which was between the center-left and the center-right, is outdated. It doesn't work anymore, because in many countries, either the center-left or the center-right or both, they're not part of the national conversation or the national political landscape anymore. So then they are more sort of trying to balance that technocracy with more of sort of populism. Sometimes more of sort of a leftist type of populism, sometimes perhaps more populism that leans toward the nationalist populist. But I think this is the direction we're going, and I don't like it, and I think it would be useful to have a better conversation sort of around the future of Europe and how we can create this sort of almost federalist constitution where we combine the opportunities of the central government, in this case Brussels, to expand the power, that we have limits on power, that we have limits on what you actually can do, which is what a constitution does and what federalism is all about. It's about restricting the power access for central governments. But you can combine that with an opportunity to have a lot more variety when it comes to regulations in Europe. I think to come back where we started about the future of the UK vis-a-vis Europe, the case for institutional competition. But there is also this historical development that I think has been one of Europe's strengths through history, which is that, some governments, some princes, some churches, some regions made horrible decisions in the past, but then you could migrate to a neighboring country and you can start to do things there. And gradually that built up a learning process where we began to figure out what type of policies that don't work or what type of policies that are outright stupid. And when we centralize too much, when we live with this old Brussels model of, more Europe is always better, I think what we're missing is that the more centralized we become, the more central the mistakes we're doing are also going to be for the development of our societies and our economies. And I think we would benefit from having much more opportunities for experiments around Europe that doesn't follow one model that has been designed in Brussels.
Well, that's exactly what also Brussels Report tries to promote, not opposition against the EU, because there's still many great aspects about the European project and the European Union, but indeed, allow some trial and error, some leniency, some institutional competition, and it's great to hear that. I mean, you expressing that so well. So thank you very much, Fredrik, for this conversation. I wish you all the very best with ECIPE, and we'll definitely stay in touch.
Likewise, Peter. Thanks so much, and let's be in touch.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
the Brussels Report podcast.